My name is Uzziah Urquiza. I'm here from Southwestern Oklahoma State University, and I'll be talking to you guys about stereotypes, how stereotypes come about in society, how they're maintained, and what effects stereotypes have in settings such as education and development for children and communities that are marginalized. So taking a step in, the introduction, I just wanted to hammer home why this is important and what about stereotypes is needed to be understood to be able to address them. So, being stereotyped is a normal part of life for many. The commonality of it alone warrants concern. How stereotypes affect the development and performance of individuals has not been well defined. To address this, stereotypes must first be understood, and the mechanisms by which they persist in our society must be elucidated. So, beginning at what are stereotypes, it's important to define this using an operant definition so we can move forward cohesively. So, in 1922, Lippmann coined stereotype. Lippmann was a journalist in the 1920s. He coined the term stereotype for the socially shared representation of a social group, or more simply put, pictures in our heads of how these social groups are supposed to behave, look, react, things like that. Stereotypes have been called cultural phenomena in that they're subjective cultural or a subjective cultures, so they are a meaning system in cultures, and they changed depending on which culture you're in. Uh, Again, on that, stereotypes are not static. They can change as a function of the stereotyped group and the group of stereotypes. So as the stereotyped group develops and they prove or disprove certain stereotypes, the group of stereotypes may adjust and create new stereotypes for that group, whether that be positive or negative. And that's the last point, that stereotypes can be either a positive or a negative connotation with the social group. So an example that would be a particular group is good at a task due to a social group that they belong to, or that they're bad to a task due to a social group they belong to. So those relations we have in our mind with a certain population and completing certain tasks can be either good or bad, and both of those can have good and usually bad impacts on the stereotyped group. So again, we said we need to understand how stereotypes culminate and how they persist. So in doing that, stereotypes are what they are because they persist in society. They are reliable indications of the attributes society associates with the social categories to which that person belongs. So stereotypes don't necessarily tell us about society, but they tell us about what society thinks about these social categories to which people belong to. This is problematic because while many stereotypes do contain a kernel of truth, wherein that they are based on some truthful observation that was made at some point in time, this leads to their amplification and consequently leads to the potential for marginalization of those communities. So in the past, it's been found that when passing on information that is consistent with stereotypes or stereotype consistent is transferred or relayed much more easier than stereotype inconsistent information. This fact alone leads to the propagation of simplified characteristics of social groups, wherein that you're receiving information constantly, stimuli from the outside, and you're only able to really take in what you find to be easy to remember. And those stereotype consistent information is usually what's easier to remember because we tend to categorize people. But because of that, it leads to these stereotypes being propagated and maintained throughout society. So Huyan and Kashima in 2001 completed a study with participants wherein they passed on a story to each other, much like in the game of telephone, and the details that made it to the end were noted. So in this case, they started with a story about a football player who had very stereotypical characteristics, like very athletic, loud, but poor at academics. But they also had lots of other stereotype inconsistent information about their characteristic and had hobbies and habits and things like that. And at the end of the study, they found that in almost all of the samples studied, the stereotype consistent information was much more thoroughly reserved from beginning to end than the stereotype inconsistent information. So what this means is that the story becomes more consistent with cultural stereotypes because that's what we are propagating in our own memory by categorizing them in such a way that allows us to put stereotypes at the forefront of our memory when thinking about people that identify with specific social groups. So in looking at how stereotypes affect populations and how stereotype bleeds into the other facets of our life, stereotype threat, defined by Still and Aronson as being the risk of confirming a self-characteristic or a negative stereotype about one's group. So what this means is experiencing stereotypes your entire life puts you at risk of feeling like you have a self-fulfilling prophecy, wherein you're in when you are in situations that you feel you are at risk of being stereotyped, or you feel you are the minority and looked down upon because of certain stereotypes, you are at risk of stereotype threat because it can become, again, a self-fulfilling prophecy where you are at risk of confirming those negative stereotypes, and that acknowledgement of that risk can affect both performance and education. So again, as an example, being a student from a historically underrepresented minority, especially at the university level, can lead to a lot of stereotype threats wherein they automatically fall into this sense of self-deprecation by characterizing themselves as a negative stereotype, thus leading to results seemingly to agree with that. Stereotypes are already known to be associated with the anxiety of being a potential target of prejudice, which makes this stereotype threat such a strong topic. Still and Aronson hypothesized that the self-threat it causes may interfere with the intellectual functionings of these students. So the hypothesis of their work was that stereotype threat not only affects the performance, but interferes with the learning of the students in the classroom. So not only affects the output, but affects the quality of input for these students. In their study, they found that Black participants consistently scored lower than their white counterparts in similar threatening or non-threatening situations. Those situations could be anywhere from having to note your ethnicity down before taking an exam, or being the physically only minority in a classroom. Either one of those things was enough stimuli to trigger that stereotype threat in these students. So stereotype threats effect on education. Again, similar to the past study, it's important to acknowledge how stereotypes affect the minority population's psychology because they endure these social assumptions daily. Negative stereotypes can be harmful to a person's self-esteem and thus performance. This behavioral trend can be observed in almost any classroom in America. Therefore, understanding what triggers this negative impact on education is key to preventing it. Taylor and Walton in 2011 completed 2 studies to test how stereotype threat affects African American students' performance on exams. These tests assessed whether stereotype threat could undermine the acquisition of academic knowledge. They found that exposure to threatening scenarios, ranging again from being the minority in the classroom to simply marking ethnicity, reduced both performance and learning for African American students. When looking at how stereotypes develop and how to mitigate them, the contact hypothesis is one that comes up often. So previous research shows that intergroup contact can help reduce the prejudice within those groups, which was proposed by Allport in 1954, who established the contact hypothesis. However, there's been little research on how prejudice changes within the majority and minority populations in relation to their different experiences to that stereotype. So an example, being the marginalized community and experiencing prejudice is much different than being the majority and experience prejudice. So the contact hypothesis predicts that with more intergroup contact, there will be less intergroup prejudice, but that may be true for the majority population, where if the majority interacts more with the minority, they will feel less hatred towards them. But that's not always the same being the minority, having more exposure to the majority may not confer the same emotions. So that's what this next study is going to be focusing on. Chop and Pettigrew in 2005 used meta-analysis of hundreds of different studies to examine how prejudice differs in majority members and minority members. The results indicated that the relationship between contact and prejudice tend to be weaker among members of minority status groups than among members of majority status groups. And finally, I'd like to touch on stereotypes in a rising field of study as a positive category for the human brain and as a key attribute of survival and persistence in the human population. So to start off this quote, the myth is not necessarily false. It might happen to be wholly true. It may happen to be partly true. If it has affected human conduct a long time, it is almost certain to contain much that is profoundly and importantly true. So working with this quote, Lee, Macaulay, and Josim. Again, this is from Lippmann, who coined the term stereotype. Lee, Macaulay, and Josim took this quote and argue that stereotypes are necessary for survival as categorical importance because stereotypes represent a type of totem for civilization today, wherein that we can more easily store information about others using stereotypes and can pull from that when we don't have any other definitive information to pull from to make assumptions. And because of that, stereotypes can be a positive category. So a primary task of humans is classification and categorization to avoid chaos. And because of that, any categorization is deemed superior to chaos, argued by Lee, Macaulay, and Josim. Thus, both stereotypes and totems are products of human categorization. They argue that people rely more heavily on stereotypes in the absence of useful individuating information than in its presence. Thus, they function not as a first option, but as a best guess when there is a lack of other information to inform the individual on the decision to make. So with that, I have some concluding thoughts. Number one, Trop and Pettigrew. Their meta-analysis revealed that the minority population is affected most by the parameters of the contact hypothesis. Number two, Aronson and Steele in 1995 defined stereotype threat as being at risk of confirming as self-characteristic a negative stereotype about one's group. And number three, Leon and Kashima 2001 investigated the maintenance of stereotypes in society. They found that information that is considered stereotype consistent with the person's physical attributes is relayed more easily. With that, these are my references. Thank you.